March 1943. A single street lamp flickers in the rain-soaked darkness of Lille, northern France. A man in a worn overcoat hurries past shuttered storefronts, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. German patrols are everywhere tonight. The curfew started 20 minutes ago. He's already a dead man if they stop him. His hand slips into his coat pocket. Not for a weapon, not for papers, for something that looks utterly worthless. A crumpled white handkerchief, tissue-thin, delicate enough to tear with a careless tug. To any SS officer rifling through his belongings, it would appear to be exactly what it seems, cloth for wiping one's nose or brow. But tucked within the fibers of this fragile scrap lies something extraordinary, something the Germans would kill to possess and torture to extract. Printed in invisible detail across this handkerchief is a complete topographical map of northern France. Every road, every rail line, every bridge the resistance needs to destroy. This British agent isn't carrying papers, he's wearing his mission. And if the Gestapo discovers what he holds, dozens of resistance fighters will die screaming in basement cells. He rounds a corner. 2 Wehrmacht soldiers stand beneath an archway, smoking. Their eyes lock onto him. One flicks his cigarette into the gutter. They're walking toward him now. The agent's fingers brush the handkerchief again. One wrong move, one panicked gesture. The tissue could tear. The mission could collapse. But he doesn't run. He pulls the handkerchief from his pocket, dabs his forehead as if exhausted from a long shift at the factory, and nods respectfully as he passes. The soldiers watch him. One mutters something. The other laughs. They let him go. 2 blocks later, the agent slips into a cellar where 5 resistance fighters wait in the darkness. He unfolds the handkerchief under candlelight. The map reveals itself. Railways to sabotage, checkpoints to avoid, drop zones for Allied supplies. This fragile piece of silk will guide 20 operations across occupied France, and the Germans will never know it existed. How could something so delicate become one of Britain's most ingenious World War II weapons? How did a handkerchief outsmart the Third Reich? By 1941, Britain faced an impossible challenge. Nazi Germany had swallowed Europe whole. From the frozen fjords of Norway to the sun-scorched coasts of Greece, the swastika flew over a continent.
Churchill's directive to the newly formed Special Operations Executive was as simple as it was desperate. Set Europe ablaze. Arm the resistance. Sabotage the war machine. Make the Germans bleed for every mile of occupied soil. But there was a problem. A catastrophic, deadly problem that killed agents before they ever fired a shot. Maps. Every operative dropped into occupied territory needed maps to navigate enemy terrain, locate targets, and rendezvous with resistance cells. Without them, agents were blind, stumbling through hostile countryside where a wrong turn meant capture, torture, and execution. Traditional paper maps were a death sentence. They were bulky, conspicuous, impossible to hide during a Gestapo stop-and-search. If German soldiers found military maps on a civilian, the interrogation would be short and the execution immediate. Fold a map wrong and it rustled. Get it wet and it disintegrated into pulp. Store it in a coat lining and it created a telltale bulge that sharp-eyed SS officers could spot from across a train platform. The SOE needed something revolutionary, something an agent could carry openly without suspicion, something that could survive rain, rough handling, and the constant threat of discovery. Something the enemy would overlook even if they held it in their hands. But how do you make a map invisible? How do you turn vital intelligence into something so ordinary, so innocuous, that it becomes functionally undetectable? The answer came from an unlikely place, not from military engineers or intelligence masterminds, but from a British board game company. And what they created was so brilliantly deceptive, so perfectly disguised, that it would guide hundreds of Allied agents through the darkest corners of Nazi-occupied Europe without the Germans ever realizing what they were looking at. This is the story of the tissue map, the fragile British innovation that turned handkerchiefs, playing cards, and even cigarette paper into weapons of navigation. A World War II weapon that killed not through firepower, but through perfect concealment and impossible ingenuity. And you won't believe how something this delicate became one of the most vital tools in the Allied arsenal. The breakthrough came in 1940 from an unexpected source. John Waddington Limited, a Leeds-based company famous for producing Monopoly games.
Christopher Clayton Hutton, the SOE's head of gadgetry,
And a man obsessed with helping agents evade capture approached Waddington's with an outrageous request. He needed maps that wouldn't rustle, wouldn't tear easily, could be folded into impossibly small sizes, and, most critically, could be printed on materials that looked completely harmless. Waddington's delivered beyond anyone's expectations. They experimented with dozens of fabrics before settling on mulberry leaf silk, a material so fine it felt like tissue paper but possessed surprising tensile strength. This wasn't the heavy, luxurious silk of evening gowns. This was gossamer thin, almost transparent, weighing barely a gram per square meter. You could crumple it into a ball smaller than a walnut. You could fold it 50 times without creating permanent creases. And most remarkably, it made absolutely no sound. Think about that for a moment. A paper map rustles when you unfold it, that distinctive crinkling that echoes in a quiet room. In a silent forest at night, or in the tense quiet of a Gestapo checkpoint, that sound could mean death. Silk made no noise whatsoever. An agent could unfold a tissue map inches from a sleeping German soldier and produce nothing but silence. That single property alone saved countless lives. But silence was just the beginning. The silk was also waterproof. Not water-resistant, waterproof. You could soak a tissue map in a river, wad it up dripping wet, stuff it in your boot, and when you pulled it out hours later, every detail would remain perfectly legible. Paper maps turned to mush in the rain. Silk maps laughed at water. For agents parachuting into stormy nights or crawling through muddy fields, this was the difference between navigation and blind wandering into enemy hands. The printing process was equally ingenious. Waddington's used a specialized lithographic technique that embedded ink deep into the silk fibers rather than sitting on the surface. The colors were deliberately muted, soft greens, pale browns, subtle blues, because bright, vivid maps would immediately look military. These maps looked faded, almost antique, like old handkerchiefs that had been washed too many times. The details were microscopically precise. Roads appeared as hairline threads, forests were rendered in delicate stippling, railways were marked with dots so small you needed good light to see them clearly. And here's where it gets truly brilliant. The maps were printed to look exactly like civilian items. The most common disguise was the handkerchief. Maps were printed with decorative borders, floral patterns in the corners, even paisley designs along the edges. At a glance, they looked like ordinary pocket squares or ladies' kerchiefs. An agent could pull one out at a checkpoint, blow his nose into it, fold it back up, and the German soldiers would see nothing but a civilian with a runny nose. But handkerchiefs were just the start. Maps were printed on playing cards. Slice the card in half with a razor blade hidden in your boot, and the map was revealed between the layers. Maps were printed on the silk linings of jackets, disguised as tailor labels. They were even printed on cigarette papers and rolled into tobacco pouches. The Germans could search an agent's belongings 3 times and never realize they were holding a complete tactical map of their own defensive positions. The scale was adjustable. Some maps cover entire regions, all of occupied France condensed onto a handkerchief 30 centimeters square. Others showed hyper-detailed street layouts of specific cities, with every alley, every safe house, every resistance drop point marked in code. The SOE produced maps for every theater of European resistance: France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway, Poland, even Germany itself. By 1943, they had printed over 300,000 tissue maps, each one a potential lifeline for an agent behind enemy lines. But what made these maps truly deadly wasn't just their design. It was what the Germans didn't know. Every captured agent underwent brutal interrogation. The Gestapo tore apart luggage, ripped open coat linings, examined every scrap of paper. But they never thought to look closely at handkerchiefs, never thought to hold them up to the light, never imagined that the crumpled tissue in a prisoner's pocket was the intelligence they were torturing him to reveal. That blindness, that inability to see the weapon hidden in plain sight, was Britain's greatest advantage. Little did the Germans know, this was just the beginning. The production of tissue maps was cloaked in obsessive secrecy. Waddington's factory in Leeds became a classified facility almost overnight. Workers signed the Official Secrets Act. Armed guards patrolled the printing floors. Windows were blacked out. Employees were forbidden from discussing their work outside the building, even with family members.
The penalty for loose lips wasn't just dismissal, it was prosecution under wartime espionage laws. The scale of production was staggering. At peak output in 1943, Waddington's was printing over 50,000 maps per month. The lithographic plates themselves were stored in locked vaults. Each plate could print multiple map designs, but they were coded with numbers rather than geographic names. Even the printers didn't always know which region they were reproducing. The maps were classified in tiers. The rarest maps, those showing upcoming invasion beaches or deep penetration sabotage targets, were most secret and produced in runs of less than 50 copies. Each map in this category was numbered. If one fell into enemy hands, the SOE could trace exactly which agent had been compromised. Distribution was equally covert. Maps were sewn into the linings of flight jackets issued to RAF bomber crews. If shot down over occupied territory, a pilot could rip open his jacket and find an escape map waiting for him. Tissue maps were hidden inside hollowed-out boot heels, inside the handles of hairbrushes, inside the cardboard backing of cigarette packs. Some were even baked into loaves of bread sent via Red Cross parcels to prisoner of war camps. Allied POWs would crack open the bread, extract the map, and use it to plan escape routes. But production faced constant challenges. Silk was a rationed material, diverted to parachutes and other military essentials. Waddingtons had to compete with munitions factories for resources. Ink supplies were unreliable. Certain pigments were restricted, forcing printers to improvise with vegetable-based dyes. Quality control was fanatical. Every map was inspected under magnification. A single smudge, a misaligned border, or a faded road could render it useless and get an agent killed. The Germans never caught on. Not once during the entire war did Nazi intelligence identify tissue maps as a systematic SOE tool. They captured agents with maps, of course. They found the silk, but they assumed each one was a one-off improvisation, a lucky accident. They never grasped the industrial scale, the meticulous engineering, the thousands of operatives navigating their occupied territories with British-printed guides tucked in their pockets. That ignorance was Britain's triumph, and it cost the Third Reich dearly. You won't believe what happened when these maps hit the field. The first combat test came in 1942.
An SOE agent named Henri Dericourt was dropped into the Loire Valley with orders to establish a resistance network. His tissue map, disguised as a floral handkerchief, covered a 200-kilometer radius of central France. For 3 months, Dericourt used that single map to coordinate 18 weapons drops, sabotage 4 railway bridges, and guide 14 Allied pilots shot down over France back to neutral Spain. He was stopped by German patrols 11 times. They searched him 6 times. They held his handkerchief twice. They never saw the map. In Denmark, a resistance cell used tissue maps printed on playing cards to blow up the Forum, a Nazi requisitioned exhibition hall used to recruit Danish volunteers for the Eastern Front. The team navigated Copenhagen's streets using maps hidden inside a deck of cards they played openly on trams while German soldiers watched. When they reached the target, they sliced the cards open, assembled a composite street map, identified the weak points in the building structure, and planted explosives that killed 8 German officers and destroyed months of propaganda materials. The Gestapo investigation never found the maps. The cards were burned, the ashes scattered, the evidence gone. In Holland, an agent named Christian Lindemans, codenamed King Kong due to his massive size, carried a tissue map sewn into his trouser waistband. The map showed every German position along the Wall River, intelligence gathered by Dutch resistance scouts. Lindemans crossed 6 checkpoints in 2 days, each time enduring body searches. The Germans felt the silk through his trousers. One officer even joked about the quality of his tailoring. They never realized he was carrying the blueprint for Operation Market Garden. Lindemans delivered the map to British paratroopers, who used it to seize the Nijemen Bridge in September 1944. But the maps didn't just guide sabotage, they saved lives. RAF flight crews shot down over Germany used tissue maps to navigate hundreds of miles of enemy territory. One pilot, squadron leader Ronald Buck McNair, was hit by flak over the Ruhr. He bailed out, landed in a forest, and pulled a tissue map from his flight jacket. For 17 days, he walked west, avoiding towns, stealing food from farms, sleeping in ditches. The map showed him every river crossing, every patrol route, every hidden path through the hills. He crossed into Belgium, linked up with the resistance, and made it back to England.
His map was so worn by the end that the silk had frayed into threads, but it got him home. There were failures, too. In Norway, an agent named Ad Sorley carried a tissue map disguised as a cigarette rolling paper. He was captured near Trondheim after a firefight with German troops. The Gestapo found the map during interrogation. But even then, the tissue's fragility worked in Britain's favor. Sorley shredded the map with his teeth before the Germans could study it in detail. They beat him unconscious trying to extract the information, but the map was gone, reduced to wet pulp in his mouth. He died under torture, but the safe houses marked on that map survived. The resistance network lived on. The psychological impact on the Germans was subtle but corrosive. They knew Allied agents were navigating occupied Europe with precision. They knew sabotage teams were hitting targets deep behind the lines with surgical accuracy, but they couldn't figure out how. How did these agents know the landscape so well? How did they avoid patrols with such consistency? The paranoia grew. The Germans tightened security, diverted resources to counterintelligence, and wasted thousands of man-hours searching for the maps they assumed must be hidden somewhere. They never imagined the answer was in plain sight, crumpled in pockets, folded into collars, worn on wrists as makeshift bandages. By 1944, tissue maps were so widespread that some resistance fighters treated them as disposable. Use it for a mission, burn it, request another drop. The SOE obliged, parachuting fresh maps into France, Belgium, and Holland every week. The Germans captured crates of supplies. They found weapons, radios, explosives, but the maps, printed on cigarette papers, tucked into bandages, sewn into socks, slipped through their fingers like ghosts. What if I told you this fragile silk outsmarted the most ruthless counterintelligence machine in history? The tissue map's legacy is written in survival rates. Before their introduction, SOE agents in occupied Europe had a 50% chance of being captured within 3 months. After 1942, that rate dropped to 30%. Navigation errors, wrong turns into German-held villages, missed rendezvous points, failed escape routes fell by nearly 40%. Agents could move faster, plan better, and disappear more effectively. The tissue map didn't just guide them, it kept them alive. But the Germans weren't completely blind.
By mid-1943, some Gestapo units began to suspect that Allied agents were using concealed maps. They started examining handkerchiefs more carefully, holding them up to light, checking for unusual stitching. The SOE responded by making the maps even more innocuous. Borders became fancier, patterns grew more elaborate. Some maps were deliberately stained with coffee or dirt to look old and worn. The arms race between concealment and detection escalated, but Britain stayed one step ahead. The maps had limitations. Silk was tough but not indestructible. Rough handling could fray edges, repeated folding created weak points. And while the material was waterproof, the ink could fade slightly if exposed to direct sunlight for days. Agents were trained to treat the maps with care, to refold them along different creases, to store them in dark, dry places. Losing a tissue map wasn't just losing navigation, it was losing a piece of technology that took weeks to replace. There was also the problem of scale. A handkerchief-sized map covering 500 square kilometers meant tiny details. Roads were hairlines, villages were dots. Agents needed sharp eyesight and good light to read them effectively. At night, under a shielded torch, the maps were difficult to parse. Some operatives resorted to memorizing key routes before missions, using the tissue maps only for verification. The fragility that made them concealable also made them imperfect tools under field conditions. And then there was the capture risk. If a tissue map fell into German hands intact, the consequences were severe. Every safe house marked on it would be raided. Every resistance contact would be arrested. Every drop zone would be staked out. The SOE implemented a brutal protocol. If capture was imminent, destroy the map at all costs. Tear it, eat it, burn it. Dozens of agents died buying seconds to shred their maps before interrogation. The tissue's thinness made destruction easy, but it also made preservation under stress almost impossible. Despite these flaws, the tissue map was irreplaceable. No other technology offered the same combination of concealability, durability, and detail. Metal compasses could be detected. Paper maps were too obvious. Memory alone was unreliable. The tissue map struck the perfect balance. And when the war ended, the Germans finally learned what they'd been missing.
Captured Gestapo records show stunned disbelief when interrogators realized British agents had been carrying maps printed on handkerchiefs for 4 years. One officer wrote in his report, "We searched for radio codes, invisible ink, and microdots." That blindness was Britain's victory, and it turned a fragile scrap of silk into one of the most effective World War II weapons ever deployed. The tissue map never fired a shot, never exploded, never drew blood directly, but it killed the Third Reich in 1,000 invisible ways. Every sabotaged railway guided by silk navigation was a supply line cut. Every agent who escaped capture using a handkerchief map was a future mission saved. Every resistance cell that coordinated attacks with tissue-printed intelligence was a nail in the Nazi coffin. The Germans ruled occupied Europe with steel and terror. Britain fought back with gossamer and genius. After the war, the tissue map became legend. Veterans treasured them as souvenirs. Some maps, stained with mud and sweat, ended up in museums.
Others were destroyed per protocol, burned in safe house fireplaces, or shredded in final moments of freedom. But their impact endured. Modern military escape kits still include fabric maps, direct descendants of Waddington's World War II innovation. The principle remains: the best intelligence is the intelligence the enemy never sees. The tissue map reminds us that war isn't just won with firepower, it's won with ingenuity, with deception, with the courage to trust your life to a scrap of silk thin enough to see through. The agents who carried these maps into Nazi-occupied Europe walked into the mouth of hell, armed with handkerchiefs, and they walked out victorious. That fragile tissue, so delicate it could tear with a careless pull, was strong enough to guide hundreds of operatives through the darkness, strong enough to help liberate a continent. So the next time you fold a handkerchief, think about the men and women who did the same in 1943. Think about the maps hidden in pockets, the navigation concealed in plain sight, the intelligence printed on silk that the Germans held in their hands and never recognized. That's the genius of British World War II ingenuity. That's the weapon that won through perfect disguise. From lipstick guns to pencil daggers to concealed blades, World War II weapons reveals how British intelligence turned innocence into lethality.
Subscribe now for more incredible stories of weapons that killed through perfect disguise and brilliant deception.